Well, over the last few weeks, we've been looking at bridges of love. How love can cross over a divide, or span a distance, or stretch over some sort of obstacle, to move us beyond the ordinary to the extraordinary. It was all based on material from Romans chapter 12, showing us how, practically speaking, we demonstrate love. So we started with a bridge of generosity in Romans 12, verse 13, which spans that space between a person's material resources and their needs. When they don't have enough, generosity then steps in to overcome that space. Those with enough helping those without, out of love, care, and concern. Second, we talked about a bridge of hospitality, crossing the space between stranger and beloved friend. And I suggested that really hospitality can include anything that helps cross that distance, anything that helps bring a relationship to a deeper level of intimacy. It's hospitality. Third, we talked about a bridge of blessing. This one particularly related to those with animosity towards you. We cross that gap of hostility with blessing instead of cursing. We see those who hate us as victims, more than just culprits. They are held in the vice grip of their own sin, and it's destroying them. And that just then spills out in their hatred toward us. So we feel sorry for them. Fourth, we talked about a bridge of empathy, crossing that space of selfishness by really fully entering into the sorrows and the joys of others. Because we're a body of believers. And just like a body, the experiences of others within that body are shared, because even as an individual part, we're part of a united whole. Today we'll look at a fifth bridge, a bridge of humility, which crosses the distance created by status, really, to allow us to show true love to even the most degraded. The verse for today is held together by a word that's used 3 times in the passage, 2 uses of the exact same word, and then a third that's slightly different, but a derivative. And the root has to do with our minds, the way that we think. And more broadly, we might say that it has to do with our attitudes or our perspective. So first, I just want to point out the repetition. To do that, I'm going to actually use the New American Standard Bible, because it's a little bit easier to see. Usually I typically preach from the New International Version, but the New American Standard is a more literal translation. And when it comes to a consideration of individual words, a lot of times it's more clearly seen in the New American Standard. So here it is. Be of the same mind. There's the first use of the word. It's a verb, so it's mind not as a thing, but mind as the way that you think, your thinking. So be of the same mind, be of the same thinking toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind. Again, that's the same word, again a verb. It's the way that we think. Exact same word as the first. So do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise. And there's our third use of the word. And in this case, it's the same word, though not as a verb, but now in adjectival form. So when you take the verb for thinking and you make that an adjective, it comes to mean wise, implying that it's good thinking, that it's reasoned thinking. So it's saying that we are, or do not be wise in your own estimation. So clearly, with this repetition, this is a verse about our perspective, the way that we think about things. And Paul is giving us some direction on how we should and shouldn't think. I think maybe the best way for us to approach this today is by thinking of these three uses of the word for thinking as a sandwich. 2 pieces of bread, top and bottom, with some meat in the middle. So let's start with the top piece of bread. It's that first use of the word in the text. It says, be of the same mind toward one another. And this, I think, relates to how we think about others. Expressions to this, or similar to this, are frequently found in the New Testament to describe the unity of thinking among believers. So, for example, Romans 15, verse 5, it says, now may the God who gives perseverance and encouragement grant you to be of the same mind with one another according to Christ Jesus. Being of the same mind means that as Christians, we think alike, which can sound dangerous, but let me explain that a little bit. We don't think alike in every detail. I may like vanilla ice cream, you may think chocolate's better. That doesn't undermine our being of the same mind. There's still room for individualism in this, but in the essentials, in the broad sweep of our priorities and our values and our ethics, as Christians, we think the same. Really reflecting a mind that is controlled by Christ. This is a worldview that sees all of life through this lens of our Christian faith. Everything is seen, to use the words of Romans 12, in view of God's mercy. And remember that Paul says earlier in Romans chapter 12 that we're transformed by the renewing of our minds, which means that the way that we think has the power to change us in real and dramatic ways. And really, the way that we think is supposed to be controlled by Christ. He is to be ordering our thoughts. So in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 16, Paul says that we have the mind of Christ. As we mature, we begin to see that more and more fully, that we reflect his thought patterns, his mind in us. Or listen to the way that Paul puts it in Philippians chapter 2. Let each of you look not only to your own interest, but also to the interest of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. In this case, this is a mind that doesn't look to self-interest, but looks out for others. And that way of thinking is not natural. We don't come upon that ourselves. Because on my own, my thinking is selfish and greedy and proud. But our mindset is to be based on the fact that we think with the mind of Christ. Christ molding our minds, allowing us to have really unnatural and selfless thoughts. So this is a common New Testament theme. Being of the same mind, a reflection of the fact that we as Christians share the mind of Christ. And so this gives us a unity in our thinking. Of course, unity doesn't mean uniformity. Just as a body with many parts still forms one body, a balance between individualism and unity, well, it's the same way with our thinking. We each have unique perspectives, but we are united by this common thread of having the mind of Christ. But actually in Romans, there's a little bit more nuance to it than that, because when he uses this expression, being of the same mind, he says that we are to have the same mind toward one another. I think the point is that as Christians, we are to have a mind of Christ uniting us that gives us the same attitude toward all people. In other words, a person's race, or economic status, or personality, or family background, or age, or occupation, or really any defining characteristic does not affect that we think the way that we think toward them. No matter who you are, I will think the same toward you as I think toward anyone else. And I think the issue here is the issue of prejudice. So, as James will tell us, if you show special attention to the man who wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit on the floor by my feet. Have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Judges with evil thoughts. And really judges with poor discernment. Because he goes on to say in the next verse that those who are materially poor are often the ones that God chooses to be rich in faith. So you've judged the materially rich to be worthy of some special attention. And in so doing, you've overlooked the spiritually rich, who may very well be materially poor. You've judged wrongly, and, James says, wickedly. Judges with evil thoughts. This isn't just an error in judgment. This is a destructive, damaging, repulsive, shameful, morally bankrupt way of thinking. And of course, this isn't just about wealth. I mean, you can change the variables, but the outcome is the same. Discrimination based on any factor is rooted in this same judging with evil thoughts. Anytime that you discriminate based on any factor, that is morally offensive. And in this moment in our history, this certainly has something to say to our recent protests over racial discrimination. We, as Christians of all people, should be defenders of the marginalized, advocates for justice, critics of policies, traditions that have oppressed others. We really should be the loudest voices that cry out against prejudice. But this is bigger than that. It certainly includes racial prejudice. But it's not limited to that. And certainly, black lives do matter. But all lives matter. And so maybe our slogan should be both more broad and more narrow. And we would be people who say, your life matters, which includes everyone, broader. As an individual, more narrow. That every person that we encounter, we would approach them with that thought, that their life matters, that they are important and valuable and precious and worthy of respect and worth listening to, the kind of person who should be lifted up. We are to think the same toward one another. No matter who you are, nobody gets preferential treatment, and nobody gets discriminated against. And to the degree that we live that out, that we actually think the same toward one another, not discriminating on any level, then there will be harmony among us. And that's the way that the Newer International Version puts it. Their translation is live in harmony with one another. And I think that's a great way to think about it, living in harmony. In music, when we talk about harmony, we're talking about a part that's different from the melody, but complementary. Harmony suggests that although we may be different, we can still manage to fit, to blend together. And harmony is intended to enhance the beauty of the melody. So as we live in harmony, our differences make our fellowship all the more beautiful and powerful, far beyond what could be found in straightforward uniformity. Each part is unique and balanced, complementary, all fitting together. Okay, so that's the first piece of bread. Warning against prejudice, the way that we think about others. All right, here's the second piece of bread, the bottom of the sandwich, or for us, the very last part of the verse, the third use of this word. Do not be wise in your own estimation. The NIV puts that. Don't be conceited. That first piece of bread is how we think about others. Don't discriminate. Don't show prejudice. This second piece of bread relates to how we think about ourselves. Don't be wise in your own estimation. And this phrase, wise in your own estimation, is found only one other time in the writings of Paul, and it's earlier in this same book of Romans. And it's not much earlier, it's just a stone's throw away from this reference, so close that this reference in Romans 12 is almost certainly calling to mind the previous usage. So it's in Romans chapter 11, verse 25, where he says, I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be, and here's our phrase, wise in your own estimation. And I think for us to understand what Paul has in mind in Romans 12, we have to understand the use of this phrase in Romans chapter 11. Unfortunately, Romans chapter 11 is a really complicated section, and we certainly don't have time to do it justice, all the issues that arise in there, but we just have to settle for an overview. So here it is. In Romans 9 through 11, at issue is the place of the Jews and the Gentiles in the plan of God for salvation. And here's the situation. There are many Gentile believers who are coming to faith, and that's the primary audience for the book of Romans. And they're boasting about the fact that they feel like they've ousted the Jews in their preferred status before God. That they've taken the Jews' place in God's purpose in history. And it's sort of with a sense of smug satisfaction that they look at the Jews and they think, well, they lost their chance. They had their opportunity and they squandered it. And so now it's ours. And they feel like this is their time to capitalize, the Gentiles. So in verses 17 to 18, Paul says, don't be arrogant. Don't be so full of yourselves. Because, Paul reminds them, that the only way that they have any standing at all before God is because they stand by faith. The Jews were cut off because of their lack of faith. And the Gentiles were grafted in. He's going to use some horticultural imagery of cutting a new branch into an existing stem. But he says that they're grafted in by faith. So the only reason that the Gentiles are in a better position than the Jews is because they've exercised faith where the Jews have not. But think about the nature of faith. The whole point of faith is that I put my confidence in God and not in myself, because I know that I will come up short on my own. Faith comes out of this humble spirit, an implicit recognition that I need help. I'm truly dependent on God through Christ for my salvation. In my privileged position as one upon whom God has lavished his love so that I can be called his child. Well, that is completely God's doing. And there's no place for pride or arrogance in that. Now, in the end, we'll discover in Romans chapter 11 that God has not abandoned Israel, that he will turn his attention back to the Jews at some point. And Paul makes the case that he's going to regraft them in, continuing with that horticultural imagery. And the point of verse 24 in Romans 11 is to say that if Gentiles can be grafted in, I mean, from their disparate source, this wild branch that's been kind of brought into a cultivated stem, well, if that can happen, then how much more likely is it that God can regraft the Jews back into the tree that they came from? I mean, which is more likely? That the pagan Gentiles be brought into a relationship with God whom they have never known and have no history with, or that the Jews could be restored to a relationship with God whom they have rich history with and many instances of miraculous intervention. Well, the latter, of course. The Jews are perfectly poised for revival and restoration, and it'll come, Paul says, in due time. But Paul is making the case that their facts are wrong. The Jews have not been permanently replaced. But not just their facts. Their attitude is also wrong. That there is no place for pride. It doesn't matter who you are, Jew or Gentile. The only way that you stand before God is by faith. I am utterly dependent on God's grace for my salvation, completely sinful and deserving of punishment. I have nothing to commend myself before God. I am and will be until the day I die dependent on God's intervention, made freely available through Christ. Freely available, but not deserved. Never deserved. So this is the context where Paul warns in Romans 11 about being wise in your own estimation. That's what he has in mind. Don't put yourself on a pedestal on your own. All of us, Jews, Gentiles, whoever you are, we are on our way to hell. And we are rescued from that, but that doesn't give us any reason for arrogance. It's all the more reason for humility, to recognize that we are dependent on God and His grace. And that is the point of Romans chapter 12 when he says, don't be wise in your own estimation. Don't be conceited because you don't deserve your salvation any more than the derelict on the street, or the irritating neighbor next door, or the high-priced call girl on the internet, or the alcoholic at the bar, or the adulterer on Tinder. Don't put yourself above others. Without God's intervention in your life, who knows where you would have ended up? You are no more deserving of God's favor than any other person that you come in contact with. And the danger for those who have been following the Lord for a long time is that we lose sight of our unworthiness before God. We underestimate the gravity of our own sin. I mean, by human standards, we don't feel all that bad. I mean, I know I sin, but my sin doesn't seem that offensive. Like I'm just a little bit dirty, not downright disgusting. I mean, my life seems fairly white bread. And having followed the Lord for many years, I can be distanced from my act of rebellion. But by the standard of God's holiness, which is the standard that is used, well, by that standard, I am thoroughly defiled. I'm no more worthy of God's favor than any other person that I encounter. So, don't be wise in your own estimation. Don't be smug in your spiritual condition. Don't be arrogant about the favor that God has shown you. You don't deserve it any more than anybody else. Alex Huxley, who's the author of Roots, has a picture in his office showing a turtle on a fence post. And he says that picture reminds him of a lesson. If you see a turtle on a fence post, you know he had some help. Anytime I start to think, he says, wow, this is marvelous, what I've done, I look at that picture and remember how this turtle got up on that post. I'm sure he means that in terms of the assistance that he's gotten from other people to get him where he's at. There's a point to that. But understand that we are turtles on a post, and we didn't get there on our own. If it weren't for Christ and His intervention, we'd still be stuck on the ground with all the other turtles swimming in the swamp of our sinfulness. So don't forget that. Christ is the one who lifted you out of that, put you on that fence post, not your own efforts. So that's the bread of our sandwich. Prejudice on the top slice, pride on the bottom. The way we think about others and the way we think about ourselves. And our pride feeds our prejudice, and our prejudice fuels our pride. This is like a double valley that this bridge of love must cross over. So here's the meat of the sandwich. It's right in the center of the verse. This is how we cross over these deep rifts of pride and prejudice. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Okay, that word associate is not strong enough. It's used in Scripture when Barnabas is caught up in the hypocrisy of Peter and the other Jews who are withdrawing from the Gentiles. So Galatians chapter 2, verse 13. It says, the Jews joined him in hypocrisy with the result that even Barnabas was carried away. That's the same word that's used in Romans 12 for associate. Carried away by their hypocrisy. Or again in 2 Peter 3:17. Same word is used here. You therefore, beloved, knowing this before, and be on your guard so that you are not carried away by the error of the unprincipled man and fall from your own steadfastness. Now, those, of course, are negative contexts. People being carried away by things that are damaging and destructive. But this is the word that Paul chooses to use, calling us to associate with the lowly. It is stronger than associate. Not just associate with lowliness, but be carried away with it. It is over the top. It is excessive. It is exaggerated. And there is ambiguity here as to whether Paul means lowly people or lowly things. And I don't think it matters much. The point is that we are to chase after lowliness. People who are outcast and marginalized and overlooked and underrepresented, people who are powerless and vulnerable. Well, sincere love chases after them, advocates for them, stands in the gap on their behalf, defends their cause. And lowly things, not things that are high profile or glitzy or popular or comfortable, but things that are awkward and challenging and tedious and for the most part avoided and considered low class and servile. Well, we chase after those things. We're to be carried away with the simple, with the ordinary, with the tedious, with the lowly. It's Jesus who sets us an example. When he washes the feet of the disciples, he takes up the lowly, the dirty, the humiliating task of washing the feet of those who follow him. He's in the position of power. He is the one who's in authority. He's the one who is setting the agenda among this group. And he chooses to stoop and to serve those who follow him. Peter resists. Jesus insists. Insists because there's a lesson to be conveyed. A lesson which afterward he explains. John 13, verse 14 and 15. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Michael Card was one of my favorite songwriters. Said it this way in his song, The Basin and the Towel. The space between ourselves sometimes is more than the distance between the stars. But by the fragile bridge of the servant's bow, we take up the basin and the towel. The fragile bridge of humility allows us to cross that space between ourselves and others that is sometimes wider than the stars. And maybe we should think of this more as a tunnel than as a bridge. Because humility doesn't lift us up and over pride and prejudice. It takes us down and under. And maybe down and under is the very direction we need to go. Be carried away with lowliness. So Lord, that's a challenge to our hearts, Lord, to chase after lowliness, to make that our priority, to pursue things that, for the most part, everyone else avoids. Lord, that's our desire, to be those who reflect that kind of humility, that we would overcome the prejudice that is so evident around us, the pride in our own strength and accomplishments, and instead live a life of humility, modeled by Christ, followed by us. Lord, that we would be the kind of people who find ways, practically speaking, to wash the feet of those around us. We would not consider ourselves above that we'd enter into it. Not just associating with that, but really being carried away with it, to make that our pursuit. Pray that we'll do that in the strength